typical format. Everybody, this is Beatriz. Beatriz, this is everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Beatriz Botero Arcila is an assistant professor of law at Sciences Po and an affiliate of Berkman Klein at Harvard. She holds an SJD and an LLM from Harvard Law School and is a lawyer at Universidad de los Andes, which is also where Diana is coming from. And Columbia, her research and expertise focus on data governance in urban environments, privacy law, data governance policy, municipal law, platform governance, and legal theory, all the fun stuff, in other words, Beatriz. And recent work has explored modes of data governance in smart cities projects and the sharing economy, as well as COVID contact tracing apps. Oh my goodness. Today, she'll be presenting her new work, After Human Rights for the Smart City, the Governance of Algorithmic Surveillance Technologies, which just checks a heck of a lot of boxes for us here at the workshop, Beatriz. So we're really excited to hear more about it, hear from you, and learn more about your work. So we'll take a typical format. Please feel free to take your time here, and I'll be moderating both in the room as well as via Zoom. So thanks so much again for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Hi, thank you, Scott, so much. And it's really nice to be joining you virtually. I presented once in Bloomington a few years ago already, and I hold the warmest memories. It was fantastic. It helped me a lot. So it's very nice to be here again, and I hope to do that next time in person. Let me just share my screen and we'll get going. You can see it, right?
Yes, we sure can.
Excellent. So as you can see, I've been working on the piece since I shared it. So one of the things that I tried to find was a sexier title, and that's one of the things I would love some feedback on if you have it. So the current title is Turtles All the Way Down, a friendly critique of human rights frameworks to govern smart cities, and that's me. So what I want to, so the plan basically is that I thought, since this was a workshop, I would tell you a little bit of where I am with the piece in case you have specific feedback related to that, and then just like the structure of the presentation. So like any questions or comments on the title. The second maybe is a clarification. I especially appreciate this space because I'm a lawyer by training, and that's what I teach, but this piece is not going to be published in a specially legal issue. It's the Internet Policy Law Review. I still have to submit the revised version, but they're not necessarily legal scholars. They're cyber savvy, I decided to say, and they're mostly Europeans. And for those that are lawyers, that changes a little bit the assumptions that we have of how lawyering and judging and decision-making works. One of the other things that I would really like not to do is to be fighting a straw man in this piece. So like I care about having some nuance in the argument and the other actors I'm in discussion with. And then curious on what do you think about the current conclusion. But what's the paper about? So basically, this is an intervention in what I see is an evolution from AI ethics to AI and human rights. And the key argument I'm trying to say is that I see that as a very positive development, but not necessarily one that fixes some of the issues that we have in creating frameworks for AI governance. I'm going to do that by presenting two friendly critiques of rights and legal arguments. One coming from critical legal scholarship, which is what they call the critique of rights, and another one is an internal critique to the human rights discourse, which is the limits that human rights have to address some more systemic societal risks. Then I'm going to situate these critiques within what cities have been doing already for a couple of years regulating AI, and how these critiques maybe even map into that effort. And then I'll conclude. And most of my slides have pictures of cities that I like. This over here is Amsterdam in what are sunnier times of the year. So from ethical principles to AI and human rights. For those of us who've been watching, in somehow 2018 or so, there a big proliferation of ethical principles started, in which basically spearheaded by the OECD. by the OECD, several organizations started drafting ethical principles, and these ethical principles were criticized because they were a little bit broad and didn't really establish frameworks about what privacy protective meant in practice, how you square that with transparency, what it means to be safe, and so on. And so the criticism was that this still left a lot of leeway for people interpreting these principles in a way that wasn't constraining, wasn't creating the safeguards that we wanted out of them, but also but simply not guiding developers. Like even well-meaning developers didn't really know how to interpret this. And so the conversation seems to have moved almost in parallel, but I'm going to say more recently, towards human rights centric AI systems. And this is a quote from an excellent paper on this that says that highlights some of the things some people, maybe I'm also part of that camp sometimes, see as an advantage of human standards. One of the things is that they have their global standards that create actual mechanisms of accountability that specify the way in which individuals are entitled to be treated. So human rights standards are considered to be more specific than broad ethical principles. And then another shortcoming that human rights offers to AI governance is that human rights practice, human rights scholarship, human rights jurisprudence contains already frameworks to balance one human right against the other. Those of us who are lawyers, we call this proportionality test or balancing test. And this type of conflict is something that's increasingly needed in ethical systems. Something that I should highlight before we go into this is that one of the things that are sometimes missed in this conversation about ethical principles and human rights and AI governance is that all of these are ideas that already exist in our legal systems and already are applicable to AI systems, right? So there's, I'm in Europe right now, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union already contains a right to privacy, already contains a right not to be discriminated, already contains a right to human dignity, and those rights are not non-applicable to AI systems. What the governance conversation is interested in, or it's also focused on, is how do you operationalize that in AI systems? Because one of the things that AI systems have, and I'm sure most of you in the room know, is that their obscurity, the way they work, is just harder to track, and therefore it's just harder to know if we're actually complying with these principles that are so dear to democratic societies. So these aren't necessarily new frameworks coming out of nowhere to regulate this thing that was just lawless from the beginning. It's more about how do we operationalize long-standing ideas in these new patterns, in these new modes of decision-making that involve both humans and machines. So, and this is a little bit how some of those AI Bill of Rights look like. I chose city versions of this, but there are many that aren't, like the United Nations Commission for Human Rights has issued statements of the like saying that human rights apply. But this is in particular for the city universe. This is the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights, and they are something similar to an international organization, but not a recognized one because cities don't have international legal personality. And they've been very strong lobbying and really putting forward the effort of creating this type of documents and guiding cities that are less strong in how they can govern cities, AI systems and smart city tech locally. It was founded in 2018 by Barcelona, by Amsterdam, and by New York, but it currently has over 49 cities that are members, if I'm correct. And this is from one of the cities that's been really leading a lot of this effort, which is Barcelona. And this is part of their recently issued AI governance document. This is from 2021. And as you can see, it says here that it's a set of principles, 7 governing principles that have to be followed in any technological application to ensure correct management, respect for digital rights. Digital rights is the way these people are using human rights for the digital era. It's clarified somewhere in the document before, but I didn't add it. And then they talk about human action and supervision, technical robustness, data privacy and governance, transparency, diversity and fairness, and so on, like the usual suspects of AI governance. So this is great, I think. But one of my reactions when I started first seeing this type of documents arise, I was excited by it, of course, But one of the things that as a lawyer, I was still seeing when I saw it is that this is still something that I can maneuver with. And I was maybe worried that this wasn't something that was being strongly part of the conversation. Human rights were being put forward as a way to solve for the space of maneuver offered in ethical principles. And here, I think there's still many things. They still look like principles. What is suitable risk management is also something that is soft, and those of us who are lawyers in the room know this distinction about how standards like suitable, like necessary, and so on are the type of places where judges or whoever is interpreting the legal material have a lot of like leeway to say what this actually means. So that's basically my intervention, and I start by using something, the critique of rights by critical legal scholars. That's a picture of Langdale Library, Harvard Law School, where a bunch of the CLS people were and still are to some extent. And the critique of rights is this idea or this realization that they call the loss of faith in law. And they say this is something that happens typically to lawyers in their first year of law school or so. And it's that you go to law school and thinking that judges impart justice based on whatever the texts are. And then actually, when you read through a couple of legal decisions, you realize that there's some of that. And then also the judge at some point seemed to be deciding out of the blue or based on political orientations and so on. And this is very one of the things that I'm a little bit, I don't want to say worried, but it's particular of this paper is that this is very accepted in the United States by now. I think it is less accepted in the European Union, and it's been very interesting for me to observe coming to Europe, because Europeans also like seem to feel more restrained from their law. They're more formalistic. They feel attached to the text. But what critical legal scholars say is that that's a bit a psychological thing. Like you can do a lot of things with the text, and it doesn't mean that we can do whatever with the law, right? Like if you're trying to find out whether a check is valid or not, then there's a signature or there isn't, and there's very little you can do about it. But sometimes, and especially like hard political questions or questions that involve rights, that involve principles, there is certain room of maneuver. And what the critical legal scholars did at the time, this is something that was developed in the 80s or so, was really draw attention to judges as political actors making policy decisions. This is, again, something that's common sense in the US. We've watched Dobbs and Roe versus Wade, and so this might not be particularly striking for you, but it's still something that in Europe makes them tickle a little bit. One of the things that may be interesting that I relearned when I was preparing for this is that people from CLS still think that it's very important that judges experience constraint. Like that's still part of what the rule of law entails, but it's more like a sociological constraint. We experience constraints as lawyers. Those of us who are lawyers also experience that by the text. Like there's things that you can't get out of the text, but also there's this community of practice in which we move, and that community of practice requires us to reach certain conclusions. But then there's our decisions, legal decisions are ideologically and socially situated. That's the critique of rights. One in a quick nutshell, very quick. The second critique that I'm bringing is internal to the human rights discourse. And by internal, I mean is that critical legal scholars are legal theorists, they're not practitioners, they're not necessarily, they're not committed to human rights. Actually, they're rather progressive. They're saying human rights are important, but here's what happens also when you bring the rights discourse in, and they're external to the practice. Within the practice of human rights, there's been also a long tradition to highlight the limits of human rights to address collective and complex risks and harm. So as early as the 1970s, human rights practitioners started noticing that many of the things that they care about, right, like dignity, equality, or so on, were being affected by more collective, more societal interests like the environment, economic development, war, and the rights frameworks that were individual rights were just not really good at addressing that. Like, how do you go from dignity to a right to to having economic development or so on. So human rights practitioners develop what they call third generation rights, which are rights that are collective. And these are rights like the right to peace, the right to a healthy environment, the right to economic development. This is maybe very strange for people who are in the US and even in Europe. This type of right is very controversial in Europe, amongst others, because the critiques that have been raised against them is that they don't necessarily provide. So if you recognize human rights as a collective issue, they might be used as a way to curtail individual rights, right? There's a clear distinction, there's a clear tension, sorry, between private individual rights and collective rights. And if human rights were a way to sort of to check on power from the state to the individual, then collective rights don't really seem to be as ideal there, or at least that's the critique for those of us who are from the global south. I know there's another Colombian in the room. This is very common. Like most constitutions that were written in the 80s or 90s have a right to a healthy environment, have a right to peace, have a right to economic development of some sort. And there are mechanisms to address this. There are types of collective actions that are really tailored to address this. But also one of the interesting things that's been highlighted by the literature on this type of rights is that this type of actions also fall short. And what ends up happening is that a bunch of the development of administrative agencies has in the backdrop the guarantee of a particular right. So if you think this doesn't look very different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, is more like the framing. If you think about the right to a healthy environment, then in many places in Europe, for example, there's an administrative apparatus that's in charge of guaranteeing the right to a healthy environment, and they do so by a variety of mechanisms, not unlike the ones in the US. You have impact assessments, there's permits that you need to get to pollute, you might have to pay for a tax or so on, but that's oriented towards guaranteeing what is in these frameworks a healthy environment, the right to a healthy environment. This is Medellin, which is another Colombian city that I really like because nature sort of like is embedded in the city. So what does this have to do at all with smart cities? Well, one of the things that happens is that in parallel as these ethical frameworks were being developed in the world for ethical frameworks and human rights, cities were really innovating in how they regulated in how they regulated AI really much in practice, right? So one of the things that's interesting from the smart city context is that while it's nice and sort of easier to have the policy conversation at the national, at the regional level in the EU about what we do with AI, cities were very quickly adopting, deploying, and having to deal with the potential harms of the systems. So AI localism is this term that was coined by Stefan Verhulst at NYU to portray this type of leadership of cities in coming up with AI, with mechanisms to govern AI. So Cities for Digital Rights, for example, is part of it, the one I showed you before, but there are more interesting examples now. So one of the things that I've found super interesting following the US are surveillance ordinances, which are ordinances that require city departments to, for example, go through city council before they buy surveillance tech. And so they have to justify why they need a device, how they're going to use it, and maybe submit, for example, yearly reports. There's about 14 cities, 15 cities last time I checked that have adopted such an ordinance. Something that's a little bit more, wait, I'm going to turn on the light because you can see me, I think. So give me a second. Sorry about that. This might be a little bit better. So in the EU, there's no such thing as surveillance ordinances that I'm aware of, but cities in the EU have been making a lot of progress doing something that they call AI registers. Amsterdam and Helsinki started this, and about a month ago or less, they joined efforts with Eurocities, which is another cities league, to have an open source version of this. And these are registers, as their name implies, where city governments are mandated to register all AI systems that they are adopting, and really explaining, like there's like a grid, and they need to explain a variety of things regarding the system. So depending on the granularity of the questions, but they range from why do you need the system, how are you using it, what are observations, but also how is it trained, like what data, what are the parameters through which the system is trained, and so on. And this is going well. I think AI localism published a report in December, and these all seem to be very positive developments, but there are of course limitations. And here's, I think, where some of the insights from the critique of rights come in. So a first limitation that has been shown by scholars who are sociologists and not necessarily only lawyers who've been studying this on the ground is that these systems are not really great at portraying the power dynamics behind the adoption of smart city tech. So some of the scholarship working on smart cities has really focused on highlighting that there are uneven power dynamics in how cities adopt technology. Maybe it's just really, really attractive when Google comes and offers fiber because maybe you don't have the power to offer internet yourself, or it's cheaper than our alternatives and so on. And so cities end up relying strongly on this type of companies, and that might have implications for self-governance. And then that's again a collective right. So these systems are not really great at addressing the power dynamics, and maybe we need not something totally different, but something in addition to address those. There's a technical argument that's not skeptic but cautious about AI registers, and is that the concept of AI transparency is still a bit of hopeful thinking in many cases. So deep learning algorithms, for example, is something that is just not really transparent, and it can be. And AI transparency is not the type of judicial transparency in the sense that judges need to reason their decisions and we just can read them and try to understand how the judge thought through a problem. What the research shows is that this is actually very hard to do in AI systems. And even if disclosing the data, disclosing the parameters, allow other people to test the algorithm, it's not that you can really explain how a decision in particular was being made. And then other interesting outcomes which resonate with the critique of rights also is that there's still a lot of lawyering happening. So Burcu Kurt, who's a professor at Mass Amherst, shows, for example, that city officials try to navigate and change the definition of tools that they're buying or not to make sure that they fall in or fall outside of the scope of a surveillance ordinance. And that's, we can develop this idea forever, but that also speaks to the broad term AI, right? So you can try to get out your tool out of AI as a definition to make sure it falls outside of the surveillance ordinance. Other things the research shows is that local officials are necessarily interpreting the content of rights and principles. If we go back for a second to the Barcelona bill that I show you over here, where was that? Here, there's still a lot of parameters here that can be interpreted. For example, that there need to be mechanisms of suitable risk management. So there's someone in the city government of Barcelona that needs to come up with understanding what suitable risk management is, and that gives a lot of power to that person. And that's not necessarily a bug or a feature, it's just how it is, but it's something that we should be very careful about or very attentive to. And then lastly, and something that I'm very interested in and I hope to do more research on, is that a lot of these decisions about how these rights cut, how these ordinances are applied, are falling on technical people. So there's engineers that need to make a call when they're designing, when they're creating parameters about what these standards mean. And that's something that's maybe harder to audit for at least those of us who are lawyers and that we're less used to. And also because we tend to think, maybe no longer, but the cartoon used to be that the technical things used to be like more objective. And there's a lot of judgment calls that go into deciding how something should look that's transparent, how something should look that's privacy and so on. So here's my working conclusion. A possible conclusion, and maybe if someone read the paper, and I apologize for that, maybe a possible conclusion was that we just need better and more concrete rules, like just rights are too broad, then let's come up with something that's actually concrete and like very specific. And that's maybe something that we need sometimes, but that's not necessarily my conclusion here. Like there's very good arguments for why you want to have a certain individuals with some leeway, with some power to make judgment calls on the spot, because their expertise is better, because it's very hard to anticipate tech. And so it's not, that's not necessarily the answer that I'm most interested in. So I'm left with something that feels a little bit less concrete, but still super important, which is that we just can't drop the ball now that we have digital rights. That has several ways. One of them is sustained community engagement, but also I think, and this is especially important, focusing on these new decision makers that are actually deciding how these tools are developed and deployed in place. Many of them are people developing standards, but those of you, for example, who might be following the implementation of the local ordinance in New York City, is who are the algorithmic auditors who are deciding whether an algorithm is discriminating or not, how are they doing it, what's the role, and so on. So maybe it is turtles all the way down. This is from a myth. It's a Hindu myth that asks where is the earth standing, and the myth says that the earth is standing on top of a turtle. And then someone asks, and what's the turtle standing on top of? And then someone, like the person who's answering, says on top of a bigger turtle and a bigger turtle and a bigger turtle, and it's turtles all the way down. So maybe there is something about us just having to constantly audit whoever the decision making are and coming up with ever increasing mechanisms to do so. And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see you.
I for one love the turtles all the way down reference. Our last one on this was using a black box to promote human rights. So, I mean, part of it is just the pun and the audience you're trying to attract, right? Remind me too, so you said, I got your audience slide there, but are you going to try to submit to law reviews in Europe and the US primarily, or will this be?
So actually, this is already accepted with comments at a piece and at a journal, and it's for a rather short piece, so it's supposed to be around 6,000 to 7,000 words. I'm very interested in the algorithmic auditing type of conversation, so I hope that might turn into a law review piece sometime in the future.
Perfect. No, thanks for that context. That's really, really helpful. I have a number of things because I was just fascinated and I really enjoyed it, Beatrice, but let me throw the door open first to see if there's any pressing questions, comments from the room, or of course online, feel free to use chat. Let me make sure we didn't. Okay, there's some good chat situation. We'll refer back to that. And Abby, great to see you as well. So I can kick it off and let while folks are thinking, but raise hands, okay? Okay, please, because there's a lot of good stuff here. Just a few quick things for me, Beatrice, and I'll circle back to some others. But one, this is a busy year, for the EU with the new AI laws coming about, and I'm wondering, how you see, how much space you see in that new regime for this type of local experimentation at the city level. Is that type of polycentricity encouraged still, or is this going to be another refrain of more centralization to these bureaucrats in Brussels, right? So I'm kind of curious if you could reflect a little bit how the new AI law in Europe deals with that. So maybe we'll just start with that, and I'll hold some of the other ones because I worry about going too far down too many rabbit holes to begin with.
Do you want me to go straight ahead? Or...
Yeah, I was curious too. So I was just asking you if you do, just reflecting on that.
No, I got it. I just thought maybe that's fine. That's a great question. And yes, it's crazy in Europe and keeping up. It's like a roller coaster. So two things come to mind on the spot. One of them is that one of the things in which one of the ways in which cities are very interesting at governing smart cities is that most of the things that I talked about, this is maybe something that I should have clarified, is that this is something that they do through internal policy. Because they mostly only have jurisdiction over the AI that they directly procure or that they license. So even if you could maybe think that Google Maps is like an urban tech tool, right? Like I use it to move around everywhere. that doesn't fall within the city jurisdiction. So the type of AI that cities are regulating as is the AI that they're directly procuring, that they are using to do their own decision making and so on. And that gives them a little bit of an indirect type of regulatory power that I think is still going to remain, especially because a lot of what the AI Act is doing is two things. One of them is that it's banning a particular type of tools. There's like a list of 10 things that are going to be banned. And so cities have nothing to do there. That's fine. But for high risk system, what it's mostly mandating, it's an external assessment process, or sometimes internal too. But basically, for the tools that they consider high risk, you need to do an impact assessment before. You need to do like a yearly impact assessment, things like that. So cities can always like go higher up, right? Like they can decide that even if some forms of AI systems are still legal under the AI Act, or will still be legal under the AI Act, like they can decide to ban. So there's still some leeway there, but I think there's so much there still about how the operation is gonna look like and how these standard setting organizations are gonna behave. That it's still up for grabs. But I'm gonna think more about that question. That's interesting. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. Yeah, for those who haven't been following this space as much, then we'll go to you, Simon. I mean, the EU, you're probably aware, is kind of a global epicenter for data governance, right? So the way the EU is regulating AI is going to have an outsized impact far beyond Europe's borders. So that's why there's so much attention on this point. So yeah, Simon, please. And then the floor is open.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm currently an SJD student at the law school. I have two questions, and one is building on your idea of the shortcoming of the idea of rights. I'm interested in your thoughts on beyond the 2 points that you mentioned, as rights are open-ended, they're not to solve collective issues. Also, the question of who sets the standard and who considered a right as a right. And I'm talking specifically on, like, for instance, GPI, the Global Partnership of Artificial Intelligence, which is advocated by Canada and France. They talk about the environmental impact of AI, but then will the global South be able to respond to that when the global North are setting up the standard? So do you see this also as a shortcoming of the idea of right when it comes to artificial intelligence? And the second is, would it also be actually inevitable to actually look into rights? But maybe in the future, artificial intelligence might have their own right, and there might be some dynamics between human right and artificial intelligence rights. So this actually would still be something that we should pursue further. Thank you.
All the way down, indeed. Yeah, please. So you can reflect on AG, artificial general, on the role.
Should I go?
Please do, yeah.
Right. Yeah, those are great questions. So I think to your first question, that's exactly the type of thing that some observers are starting to point at. And is that so these standard setting organizations, they have existed for a long time, right? Like I don't know, like whatever electrodomestic you have close to you, your smartphone or something, that's being designed and put out on the market based on a bunch of product safety standards that someone somewhere decides. And I think me, but also other scholars, or like other scholars, and the type of thing I want to join is calling a little bit for the politicization of those organizations in a good way, right? In the sense that maybe given that they're going to be making all these decisions about how AI systems that are consequential for people are made, maybe we should know a little bit about how that process is going to look like, right? And then I think something that's super interesting that I didn't manage to put in this piece, but I find interesting, is that one of the ways in which we lawyers tend to think about rights and about balancing rights is that they're malleable, right? So you sort of like balance one right against each other. And something that happens if you're a lawyer is that maybe you go to court and you lose once, but you can go back to court and maybe win the next one, right? Like it's an iterative process, and there's ways of being more or less realistic about it. You can think it's like Dworkin's novel or something. But actually, one of the things that happens with AI, and I'm a lawyer, I'm not a technologist, is that this ends up being a standard that actually sets a rule that is code and that is out. So it's way more fixed than the way we lawyers end up balancing. And I find that particularly interesting and particularly consequential. About the global south, I think I'm clearly from the global south. I haven't thought about that question as much. I think there's also something there about just, I mean, I think expertise is everywhere, but also I'm less stressed about expertise being in the global north in many of the things, although that might not even be true. I think if you think about environmental standards, what I would think is that a lot of this is still going to be based on policy making that is happening in the, like, lawmaking that happens in the world, right? And then they go to the standards and organization and they need to operationalize it. So it's not like they have absolutely their hands, like they can decide whatever, their hands will be bound somehow. But I think in environmental law, a bunch of the things that need to be leveraged for the global south are still happening at the very broad, very plainly spoken policymaking level, but I'm not so sure about that answer. To your second question, I don't know. I actually really hope we don't ever give rights to AI. And I think that's the direction of a bunch of the international documents guiding the AI conversation. So if you think about the UNESCO recommendations that were approved, maybe already in 2021, which was almost 2 years ago, and it has like over 100 signatories, I think that contains a provision that says that AI will not be given rights. And I think that's very positive to the extent that I really can't think of an interest, a societal interest, why that would serve a particular purpose. But maybe I'm wrong. I also haven't really thought through that question. Thank you.
This could quickly degenerate into just a chat GPT discussion. So we can do that. But other questions, other points? I'll ask for a show of hands how many people have had students who've already used it in class because, yes, please.
If there is an analogy in terms of standards, how the design is done, actually the design is used. In the case of buildings, early on, everything standard was how you design it. But now leads is about the usage and how you document it. The same thing for smart cities, something about the usage of the technology and AI that is documented and verified.
Yeah, I actually love that point. I think, so earlier I've written a little bit about data governance in cities. And one of the things that I thought at the time and still do is that in the data governance space, we tend to focus a lot on how we collect data. That is especially true in the US, sort of, but actually to a very big extent in the EU as well with the GDPR. And the key question is, like, do you have informed consent? Do you have authorization to use data in this way or another? And at the time, I thought we need to move towards what are we doing with the data? What is the actual effect? Like, even if I consented to this or that, if the data is going to be used in a way that can meaningfully harm me in the future, maybe that shouldn't be as allowed as it is today. And I think that's, so I know nothing about buildings, but that sort of resonates with your point. There's a recent piece by Daniel Soloe, who's like the biggest or one of the biggest privacy professors in the US. And the title, I haven't read the whole piece, but I really like the title, is Data is what data does. And it's aiming towards thinking about what is the data actually doing instead of us focusing on how do you collect it. And I think that might make a lot of sense in the AI context as well. Like, eventually there's some uses that might have to be banned. I think the limit of that is that, and I think to clarify, I think in law we know that harms are something that we regulate, right? You can think about permissible harms and impermissible harms, or those of you who are teachers or professors, if you fail someone in an exam, that's a harm, but it's a permissible harm, and there are reasons why we allow that. Impermissible harms are those that we actually think are illegal. I think that the limit of thinking about the harms framework is that because there are harms that we actually allow in society because they might they might fulfill a goal that we find meaningful. It's really hard. It's really hard to imagine a scenario in which you can build a comprehensive framework of what are the unpermissible harms. I don't know if that was clear, but that would be I think the difficulty of going towards that approach. But maybe that's a direction for sure.
Yeah, Gustavo, and then we can circle back to us if you want to with chat there. And Abby, I think you're dropping some really helpful links too. Please, Gustavo.
So a very quick question. So it's like I know very little about this topic, but is there any evidence, at the very least, anecdotal evidence of harms produced by data breaches, AI uses of data in the context of smart cities?
Yeah, plenty. So actually,
could you give us some examples of those?
Yeah, for sure. So I think a lot of surveillance tech is very much smart cities, right? Like if you think like cities are one of the places where a lot of facial recognition is deployed, or in urban spaces. So I don't know if you follow this sort of scandal of the facial recognition in Madison Square Garden in New York City. And the owners, I don't know, there was like some drama where the owner didn't like the former lawyer in or something. But that's actually, I mean, that's anecdotal example, but facial recognition is something that is very much a smart city technology, and that is very often discriminatory, it's biased, and it's the type of thing that you could consider, like, if it's biased, creates indiscriminatory harm. There's also some research, but this is, I haven't found examples that are very convincing at the city level, except one that was preventive, which is like a lot of the systems are also used to assign subsidies of some sort or access to different services. A hot list, for example, in the security context, like when you locate that a particular city area of the city is particularly dangerous, that's something that security agencies in cities use all the time to allocate resources of or public services that can have very, very good uses, right? Like if you decide that there is a particular area of the city that is underserved and you want to place there a library, that's great, but that often also leads to over policing and things like that might end up being harmful for the community. So I think one of the interesting things about the smart city conversation is that a lot of the horror stories that we hear when we talk about AI, and then again, most of AI and most of the tech that cities use is sort of harmless, right? Like a bunch of these things are about, I don't know, automating energy supplies or figuring out what are better routes to collect garbage or send kids to school and use school buses efficiently. So a lot of that is actually very mundane, but many of the terror stories that we hear happen in urban spaces. It's just that it doesn't necessarily fall in the smart city, like it's not necessarily labeled as smart city, but many of the security issues which are common happen in cities.
Can I have a follow-up to this?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I would say, but in that case, you have to try the cost and benefits. And on top of that, you also need to consider what's the alternative compared with the system without an AI, because I'm sure that the systems that without the AI also have discriminatory treatments and harm. So harm could go in up or down. I don't know. So it's if you're talking about crime and discriminatory things related to crime has been forever before even computers existed. So essentially, there I think in order to convince that this is producing harm, you need to compare with the alternative system that you are replacing. And in some sense, I would say maybe it's even easier to detect discriminatory activities because data is generated than before. Because data was not generated, so it was much easier to hide discriminatory treatments before. And in the case of allocation of subsidies, well, I'm sure there were other rules in place to allocate subsidies before the AI, and those allocation rules could even be worse than the ones that you are using with the AI. So again, I think my economist mind put me in the direction of start thinking about those potential alternatives. So what are the real alternatives to compare, and then also to find evidence of harm, and maybe in some cases, evidence of benefits, no?
Right. No, I think that's totally fair. And I think that's something that actually gets often lost in the AI ethics conversation. You pointed out to two factors. One of them is what's the alternative, and then how and the other one I'll get right back to it. But yeah, so I think you're right. I think one of the things that we need to think through is what's the alternative, and are AI systems better, and AI systems are better at identifying if well calibrated, if well designed, they're most likely better at making a bunch of these decisions. I think the anxiety from the AI ethics conversations from this idea that's maybe a wrong idea, but that's sort of where it stands, that these things are just hard to audit. So if again, maybe I'm a lawyer, and so that's where I'm coming from. In law, you have to justify your decisions. Like, I might deny you your subsidy, but I will have to write a couple of pages about how I made that decision. That's not necessarily what happens in the bureaucratic state, but you have the criteria and so on. One of the questions that we have in AI is, okay, fine, we can use the systems. And I think even in Europe, where the conversation on AI governance is very regulated, no one is saying that we are not going to use AI systems to assign subsidies. Like, it's scaled very well, it's very efficient, it's very useful, but then how do we audit these systems? And how we audit the systems is something that technically is very complex. Amongst those who understand, it's very hard for those of us who don't understand to get there. So there's like this democratic accountability gap that comes out of a lack of AI literacy where we are now in society. Maybe we'll all understand this 5-10 years from now. But how we audit the systems that are now going to be important, that's where the conversation comes. That's where the anxiety comes from. And the cost benefit analysis, that's an interesting point. And again, like, I actually totally sympathize with you. Like, I'm not necessarily, I'm a big fan of AI and tech, but one of the things that happens for us lawyers when we consider cost benefit analysis is that the thing that rights do is that we weigh things more, even if they're not necessarily very efficient. So we weigh your dignity a lot, even if maybe that's going to be more expensive, or we consider the presumption of innocence as something that is super valuable, even if it is very likely that that kid somewhere in a dangerous neighborhood might actually commit a crime. You know, like statistics show that most people in most cities around the world who commit crimes are kids from vulnerable communities, somewhere between 16 and 28. Like, they are the ones in prison, they are the ones committing crimes. They're also the main victims of crime, which is something that a lot of us miss. And so, yes, the statistics shows that these kids somewhere in the neighborhood are very likely to commit a crime. But then in law, because they have a right to the presumption of innocence, we're going to sort of relax the weight of the number a little bit and consider that presumption of innocence, the presumption of innocence, as something that should also guide our decision making. That sounds very weird said out loud, because it sounds almost ridiculous, but I think those are the values that democratic societies stand for. And there's a lot of it that matters too, because you could imagine that there's maybe one of those kids who's going to beat the statistic, and we want to give them a chance. And that's something that's hard to do when you're thinking about an AI system making that call.
So many things that are exciting to follow up on. I like how you equated the police body cameras basically with algorithmic transparency, which is kind of what we're at in both veins, right? And as Beatriz was saying, it's a lot easier said than done for the latter. As we're still in an early phase of being able to unpack this black box reference. And there's also some national security overtones there as part of this, like, why do we care thing, including that. But there's this whole thing on the safe cities from Huawei that Angie and I wrote about a year ago, which is a whole nother level that gets more into geopolitics stuff. But I mean, at individual human rights, all the way up to kind of national security concerns about who has access to these data that are being aggregated. There's a lot of levels there.
Turtles all the way up.
It turtles all the way up, and there you go, Beatrice. Turtles all the way up. That could be a nice actual.
I'm just like
No.
the mid turtle somewhere, like.
As long as we had turtles in there, ideally mutant ninja variety would be good too. So I think Alfonso and Doc are both, I think, up next. And hopefully we can do a lightning round after that if we need to. But Alfonso, I think I saw your hand go up first. So if you wanted to go, feel free, and then we'll turn to Doc. And you might be muted, I'm sorry.
You're
Alfonso, I
muted.
think you're muted. There we go. Sorry.
Yeah, I see that I am. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed reading your paper. And it's so comprehensive as well. And I was trying to think how I can make a contribution, but at this point in time, I don't really think I can until I read it again in more depth and digest it and kind of go over the ideas in the paper. Nevertheless, I found it fascinating for two reasons. One is that you mentioned the issue about auditing. I know this is not, it's not what make it could be practical, but one of the things I think that could be done with your work is that students who are interested in doing a dissertation using quantitative and quantitative methods to assess local communities and how they're dealing with this AI technology and smartphones and market activity. And the other thing is that I had the experience very recently in the United States. I was traveling in Florida. When I returned, I found out I had a toll charge had to be paid out of my bank account. Now, I had not given anybody my bank account number other than the leasing company who I rented a car. So by that leasing, the state where I had traveled was able to tax me for a toll charge that I was unpaid for, other than through my bank account without my knowledge. But anyway, that was a way of raising taxes for the local government. But anyway, I just wanted to comment that I think that what your paper does in terms of a framework is a interesting kind of production that a research or dissertation or other dissertations can really evaluate those kinds of things that you've been talking about, as well in terms of how these things are practically used and what the outcomes would be. Some kind of evaluative kind of research. So I hope that may be helpful in terms of our understanding of what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
No, thanks a lot, Alfonso. Doc, please.
Yeah, I want to raise a flag for the individual here. We are still in the mainframe age of AI. It's really early. And as late as the 1980s, personal computing was unimaginable. We only had mainframe computing. And right now, personal AI is almost also unthinkable. And so I worry a bit about policymaking and other forms of decision making that presume that the only kind of AI we'll ever have is of the corporate sort, and especially with the last remark here. I mean, imagine if there is a requirement, a policy requirement, that any data collected about us, our AI can munch, because we can't just take the sum of it and try to figure that out. But in time, we are going to have AI of our own that allows us to make better sense of the world. And a lot of the better sense that we need to make is going to have to come from entities that are collecting data about us. And on the policy side, I worry about this because what happened with the GDPR, one of the unintended consequences of the GDPR starting in 2018 was because the GDPR said that we are merely data subjects and not independently capable entities that could do processing and controlling of our own. All the assumption was all processing and controlling was on the part of other parties, and they gave rise to $1 billion business in interfering with our use of the web by putting cookie notices in front of us that are fatuous, unenforceable, unauditable, and all the rest of it. And still, there's very little imagination about what we could do with this or how we could have independence on our own. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there.
That's super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no, we'll take it.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, looking around, I had one other, but Abby, did you want to do it? Well, I know you have a lot of good links there and.
Yeah, just super interesting. And I'm with Doc, with large language models, we are entering into a new era. And so the one thing I would say on the paper, Mia, is we're now having to figure out what the words mean a little more clearly in terms of artificial intelligence, smart city technologies and all of that stuff. So I think following what terminology, in terms of not using AI too loosely because it can get very confusing, especially when everybody's got ChatGPT on their mind. But it's going to be fun times for all of us. And Doc, I feel like we're at the start of the internet, and
Yeah.
we get to play.
Thank you.
Ran around in the search wars. Google lost 100 billion in value right after there, and I made a mistake in that. Another.
I had one more thing.
Yeah.
We're also watching the collapse of Google and Bing and Microsoft and Google at the same time now. It used to be that when the web was new, it was a library. It had static qualities. You could browse it and search these things called domains and locations and so forth. I've been writing on the web since 1995. I have an enormous corpus out there. This morning I searched some stuff I wrote. Google and Bing didn't find it, but an AI did. And that was the perplexity.ai. Check that one out because it comes to sources. It says, where did you find this? And the source that found it was actually a tweet by somebody pointing to it. But PageRank isn't there anymore. Google's not, they may index the entire web, but they're not searching it the way they used to, where we had a cognitive sense, oh, there's a library out there and this entity has indexed it for us and we can find stuff in it. It doesn't do that anymore. It's doing something else. So
As of this week.
as of this week, like this is a new thing. Yeah.
I haven't tried it. I want to.
I have to check that.
Yeah, who has Microsoft Edge now on their computer? Me.
There you go. Exactly.
Maybe one other final question as we're wrapping up, Beatriz, and then feel free from there to give any closing thoughts you would like. This has just been fascinating, but I know I'm sure you're aware of Ona Hathaway at Yale, and she did this paper a number of years ago now about do human rights treaties matter? So after countries sign up to human rights treaties, does that actually change their performance in any way? And they just did a new one last year around the rise of these. I'll put a link in the chat of non-binding international agreements. I'm talking about Empiric's Gustavo. They analyzed 3,000 agreements to see how the U.S. actually changed policy in response to these executive agreements and otherwise. So I'm just thinking in the future of, international AI governance, and I agree with Doc, it's too early, though we're seeing more and more countries releasing AI strategies and there's some cross-pollination that's happening, right? But assuming that the future is going to be more polycentric, more non-binding, do you see any, low-hanging fruit options for where we could, build some agreement like around human-centered design or public benefit or whatever it might be, whether that's in the EU or otherwise? Like, do you have any hopes, in other words, for finding some of that elusive common ground here internationally?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if so I actually maybe a starting clarification is that I think there's still a lot of value in the performative role that a human rights language creates. Like even if I'm the first one to say this feels loose and I have no idea what it means or something. I think us lawyers experience the law in a very particular way. And I think most people still hold that this has particular meaning. And if you're a company, if you're a university, if you're an actor deploying AI in any way, and you have to abide by some form of anti-discriminatory mandate, you need to at some point show how you're doing that, right? And I think that still creates a lot of value. So I actually think I'm very optimistic about these frameworks as they're adopted widely, creating somewhat like a better ground, even if there's still, I don't know, the Palantirs of the world are still saying that they're privacy compliant, and I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
But most people, I think, there's still a performative role that matters. The international, I'm gonna look at that piece, the one that you shared. I don't know it. At the international level, I don't know actually. I tend to think both the US and Europe, if I'm correct, are discussing again children's privacy rights online, and I think that's something that's historically been like a common ground on the internet governance sphere, that we might. So maybe that would be, I don't know. I actually don't know an answer to that. But to the former conversation, I have a small comment, which is that one of the things that happens maybe in this type of like very rich information world is that we are constantly on the need of intermediates that do information filtering for us, right? That's what Google was very good at doing at the beginning. It's actually part of what social media did for us again. And now this Edge, which I haven't tried, but I'm very curious. That's also maybe what they're doing. And they're going to do that in a very useful way. Like I maybe spend too much time on Twitter, but I still find it a net useful tool for me. And these tools are also going to be useful, but again, just as we are hyper cautious and very attentive to what are the content moderation parameters and settings of these companies, and we find out that sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. That's still going to be the case with something like Edge or Open or the different OpenAI developments, the generative model. So I think that the auditing type of conversation, that's going to be very important for us to just understand how these things are making decisions for us and interpreting the world for us in many ways.
I mean, governance is so central there, you're right. I mean, if you ask ChatGPT, what car should I buy? It won't tell you right now. Right? But that's just because the designers decided to block that. There's nothing stopping another chatbot from answering that for you.
No, but I
so
actually
many
also
fascinating
asked
questions.
ChatGPT, what are their human rights? What are the limits of human rights for AI governance? And it wasn't what I expected, but it had something to say, which I thought was interesting, was fun.
And Joyce, in your comment about human right to AI, right? Like human right to internet access. There's so many ways to go, but we're out of time. Beatriz, thank you so much. That was lovely.
Thank you so much for having me. So nice to see some friendly faces, old faces, and new ones for sure.
Fantastic, yeah.